All right. Here comes Kate Bauman too. We'll wait for her to get in here to start. Someone's got a recording going in the background somehow.
Very distracting.
So just look and see if you've got something that's just playing in the background. So in a very real way, this is where the rabbi begins to say, here's how you do something. And his three big topics are the Environmental and Social Responsibility Amendment, the Global Generosity Plan, and a cooperative and caring legal system. Just very quickly, without getting into a lot of detail, which one of those kind of touched your being the most? Which one of those kind of rang for you the best? And why?
To me, they're all very symbiotic. So I don't know that I would choose one over another, because to me, it's all very interconnected.
I agree with you on that. The reason I guess I'm asking is because all of them are really huge too. And so I guess what I'm kind of asking with that is, which one is going to most easily get you moving and doing something?
For me, probably the environment, because that's something we can undo policies and stuff, but when we rape the earth, Mother Earth, that's pretty permanent.
It's pretty
And
permanent.
that's probably the biggest crisis. I mean, the other things I'm equally caring about, but the environment's something we can't really undo easily.
Yeah. Here's the really good news, Judy, for Mother Earth, not necessarily for us. Mother Earth is pretty good at ultimately stopping the one who's hurting her better than the one who's hurting her is going to stop her.
Yes, I know that, but still, it's like, I would like for the human species to kind of stick around a little bit.
I would
And
too.
also, I mean, to me, the environment, that's kind of like, you can't deal with the other two until you deal with the environment.
Yeah, because that is the most immediate right now. We have put ourselves in a perilous spot.
But I'm not sure we can deal with the environment without dealing with the materialism and that's generated by the capitalist system we have, that continually uses the resources of the earth in an abandoned way, and just drives us further and further. And as Rabbi Lerner says, it's tough because the politicians want to respond to the needs of their constituents, and their constituents are saying more jobs, more stuff, more consumption, more illicit use of the resources of the earth. Yeah. And so there you go.
Well, and especially Harvey, when it's tied to when goodness is tied to the have more system, right? And so if you're a better person, especially if we get to any of the prosperity gospel type of things, God's blessing me with all these things. And I wonder when it is that God says, I only blessed you up to X amount. Everything past that is what you've got taken for your own, right? Because I think God is more of a God of enough than what we are people of enough.
That's an interesting way to say it.
How about the rest of you? What kind of struck you on these?
Well, I was pleased with the abolish the electoral college and the public funding elections, because I think maybe that's gonna happen. That's possible.
Why is it, Judith, do you think that we so easily just keep holding on to anachronisms? Right? Because I know why, like the college was put in place. Nothing about today really supports it in the same way.
Right. We just get going. It's like in physics, momentum. Get going in one direction and can't change direction.
We do not easily, the inertia makes it so we do not easily
Yes.
stop, right?
Yep, yep.
Yeah. Especially when you see it like in the 2016 election, the electoral college not being there would have changed that election completely. And so it benefited a whole bunch of people.
Yes.
Takes 38 states to get rid of the electoral college, and a lot of those states benefit from it. So
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine that ever changing in our foreseeable future. Easy to understand why more liberal-minded people
Yeah.
want to change.
What's really interesting about that though, Greg, is, okay, have I told you about my Granny May? You know my Granny May.
Yeah.
She was my dad's mother. She was raised in Northeast Arizona, right? Born in Greer in the 1890s, and basically voted Democratic her whole life, as did most of Apache County up until the last 20 to 30 years. So when we say that these states are not going to, it's because sometimes we haven't made the effort to try to help them to understand how it benefits them to do it. The Democratic Party essentially gave away the rural areas over the last 3 decades. Those were not Democratic counties before that. In Arizona, at least. That may not be true about every state.
Oh, that was true in New York State.
Yeah. So part of the question you have to ask is, how do we re-enter those spaces and change the conversation in one way or another? But I guess that's his thing in all of these questions, is how do we change the conversation?
Yeah.
And how do you like some of the ways he's changing the conversation? Right? In the environmental amendment, he's saying something has to be written in stone, essentially, so that we have it as a priority. In the second one, we have to decide to have a conversation differently about money. And it has to be around not consumption and piling up of money, but generosity. And look at that in a whole different way. And the third thing, we have to redefine how we judge each other and what we do in those systems of judgment and punishment. How do we, I look at that and I go, I agree with every one of those things. And I go, how do I get the conversation to be different than what it is? So how many have, who has at least a partial solution to one of them? And that's where we'll start.
I don't have a solution. I have a question. When he was
Yes.
talking about keeping the military, close the bases around the world, but that they could be used against genocide, but not let the United States or NATO be in charge. I didn't quite grasp that.
Well, I think what you want to do is think of it this way. The UN forces right now are already peacekeeping forces. They don't go in and cause war. Their
Right.
job is to be, but they have we've in a very real way given them very little power. And so essentially what he's trying to say is, how do we switch who has power in those situations?
Oh, okay.
Right? And it's tough because we've learned that power means more guns, more weapons, larger strength. And he's trying to make us view military through a whole different definition. And that's not going to go away easily. Look at our budget. The solution to most of our economic problems in America is a relatively small reduction of the military budget, and we can't figure out how to make that. Go ahead, Leticia.
Part of it's a cultural change. I remember growing up and hearing from my mom when we hit a recession, her saying in the 70s after Vietnam, saying, we just need to get in another war and our economy gets fine.
Yeah, yeah.
But and that is part of the sense is that economy spurs, war spurs economy. But it doesn't have to. I mean, that doesn't have to be the only driver of economy. There's good reason why people think that it was World War II that solved the Depression. Not all the policies that Roosevelt did. There's some good things to back that. But it doesn't mean it's the only thing. It just means it's a quicker route sometimes. And are we willing to do the more detailed work that has to happen to let something else be the solution?
So I want what President Biden says about clean, the environmental things, stimulating jobs. But I'm not enough of an economist to know how that would happen, except that I know it wouldn't happen quickly or probably smoothly for everyone. But is there a possibility that that kind of effort would stimulate the economy if we really put our heart into it?
It could, if we could truly convince ourselves that we have to beat our swords into plowshares, right? The passage from Isaiah, and it has to be somehow, we could retool just about any plant to manufacture something different than what it's manufacturing. We just have to make the decision that new thing to be manufactured is more important than the other thing, which is right now driving their particular economy, their industry. So something like here in Tucson, where we are dependent on a couple of big military industrial plants, right? I don't want them to just go away. I want them to begin manufacturing something different so they can continue to give to the economy of this city, but I don't want to keep making war machines.
Yeah.
And how do we convince an industry like that to change?
Well, the military industrial complex has not always been this huge, I don't think. I remember Eisenhower reading that Eisenhower even talked against this. So when did it become so bloated?
Here's basically what happened. I'm just going to show you on here. So if this was the turn of last century, 1900s, we were way down here, and then we had a bump up in World War I, and it came back down, and then it stayed down here like this. World War II, it bumped up again to basically its highest level, but it only came down about halfway. And since World War II, we've stayed at a higher level like this. And so post World War II, and in a very real way, post becoming the dominant military force in the world, we haven't been able to step away from it. Go ahead, Leticia.
One of the things we have to remember in Tucson, and it's something that my dad kind of put in our heads, is that we as a community forget to realize if there is another big nuclear threat, this area is gone. We may not have missiles that are active, but they're still out there. This area would be one of the first hit because of the number of missile silos around us.
Could well be true. And do we want to continue in that space of danger?
And do we want to speak, excuse me, as a community to that?
Uh-huh. Mhm. But the hard part is, go ahead, Greg.
The continuation of the military spending after World War II was driven by the Soviet Union, United States Cold War. But that went away 25, 30 years ago. But now conservatives have a higher fear sensitivity than liberals do. And Republicans work for the interests, corporate interests, and many corporations are enriched by military spending. So those two things, keep military spending high.
Yeah.
And what's hard is how does one know when fear is justified and when it's exaggerated? So
Yeah. Is Korea truly something to be fearful of, or something to keep your eye on? Sometimes you don't know that until the kid throws his tantrum, and suddenly you're in the middle of having to deal with a bigger issue than what you wish. And so I think you're right that Republicans are good at being able to say, let's deal with it ahead of time. I'm afraid of it already, so I'm going to spend enough money that I don't have to worry about it later. But that means you spend a lot of, for me, less appropriate dollars, because ultimately they get wasted. And you end up with a lot of old armaments in silos, right? That weren't ever needed.
one division in the Republican side is libertarians who are, in my understanding, predominantly Republican, but they are more isolationist. They don't want interventionism like other Republicans do. I don't know whether that presents an opportunity.
But at least now you're getting into the conversations that we have to do. Who do we find some common ground with to be able to have this conversation? Are there people who don't necessarily want government to be spending as much as they are, even though they might be conservative? Are they on a space where we can talk about this issue?
The centrists on the right side are going to be closer to your ideology on this than the far right.
But that's not always true, Leticia, because if this is the left-right spectrum going this way, what you're talking about here is a different spectrum. Libertarianism is here, and you can be far left or far right and still be heavy libertarian. All right. And so you can have, we have to sometimes change the conversation from just being liberal conservative. Harvey, did you have something to add?
No, I was just rubbing my eye, actually.
I just kind of saw you out of the corner of my eye, so I couldn't tell for sure.
Leticia, do you have more to say about center right?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Oh.
You
Jim.
broke up. I didn't hear you.
I think the real hard part is that from here to here is a long distance, but up here or down here, there's conversation ground there because you're having conversation around different issues than what keeps you apart this way. Because there's a lot of distance from here to here, and you can both be leftists, but very different type of leftists, or rightists, and be very different that way. And we just have to start. We have to step away from the dualistic. There's only there's only one way to define each person.
Well, somebody mentioned Eisenhower, who I think one of his last speeches as president warned about the military-industrial complex. I mean, he was a Republican, former supreme commander of the European theater and thought that there were exaggerated claims about the need for more military spending. And he called out that it was corporate interests who were helping exaggerate those claims. So now that was a long time ago, but again, he was a conservative Republican. So it gives hope that others might be open to that perspective.
And what you have to do is find how they would be open to it. If I am tying my salary to a certain thing, there's an interesting movie that you should watch if you haven't watched it. It's called Why We Fight. And it kind of examines Eisenhower's statement and shows how it's played out. Okay, and why we've gotten into some of the spaces that we've gotten into. And part of their definition of why we've gotten to this space is because very deliberately, military has placed something important in every single voting district so that every single district has some reason to keep the military alive. For example, here in Tucson, which tends to be a very liberal space as a whole, has Davis-Monthan, and we want and need that for our economy. That's important to Tucson economy. And so we have a stake in keeping the military industrial complex going. And that's true about the contention in the movie is that that's true about every single voting district.
We also have Raytheon, and Raytheon, I mean, it's not just that we make all these weapons, we sell these weapons to countries all over the world who really we shouldn't be selling to.
Yeah.
Or anybody, actually. I mean, why are we selling our weapons of mass destruction to Yemen or Syria or wherever? Not Syria maybe, but others places.
But part of his contention in here, and this is the global generosity plan that he's talking about, is about the retooling. How do we essentially not say to Raytheon, close your plant down and make it all stop, but how do we retool that plant so that they're continuing to make money, but off of something different?
Yeah, I think it's easy to like have this perspective like it's evil for these companies or the military to want to have income. You know, in 2018, I was doing the Get Out the Vote, going door to door, and I met this young family, husband and wife, and they were so tense with each other because he was a Democrat and she was a Republican. And she just told me, you know, I kind of questioned her and asked her about her feelings about Trump, but she said, Trump is for us. She worked for the military. I mean, this is her job. You know, that's like at core, this is her income. So the complexity of this situation has to address that reality. You know, you can't just have a philosophy like, oh, we should spend less on the military, or we shouldn't, you know, these companies that are supplying. I mean, it's real people's lives. That's the issue, is their fears and their needs, you know.
That's right. One of the things that I remember from that movie I was telling you about is they had this woman that they were interviewing, and behind her you see the munitions line, and later on you see her actually putting whatever it is she's putting into the missile that's in front of her, right? And she said, if there were other jobs, I'd do those, but this is the job that's available to me. And so literally from her point of view, she depended on that munitions factory. So how do we give other economic spaces for people so they don't have to?
Well, you have then to start at the very basic element of our society. And I mean, socialism has become a word that's like the Republicans have demonized. I mean, you say the word socialism and people go, oh, you know, it's like scared to death of it. And, you know, it's like, I looked at like the tenets of capitalism, there's 5 big tenets to capitalism. That's economic freedom, voluntary willing exchange, private property rights, profit motive, and competition. Laissez-faire capitalism is like there's no checks or controls. Mixed capitalism, there's some government regulation. Crony capitalism demands from business for favorable government intervention and government incentive to intervene in the economy. The success of business depends on the favoritism shown by the government in form of tax break, government grants, and other incentives. We would have to go in and change the very basic tenets of capitalism and embrace like something like socialism or even democratic socialism. Like, to me, you know, we bandy all this around, but to really understand what those mean, it's like democratic socialism rejects any kind of authoritarianism, rejects planned economies, believes workers should share more in profits, strong safety nets are essential, increased minimum wage, Medicare for all, and free college. And it's like, why is that such a why is that so divisive? It's like, you know, we label things in this country and then people are turned off by it without really understanding what that means.
Yeah, it's because we're sitting, Judy, as a general rule, we're sitting in political slogans rather than in conversations.
Sound bites.
I remember learning the definition of communism when I was a kid. And we always called it communism with a small c. And I loved it. It was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need.
Mhm.
That was the definition of communism, but we always said with the small c.
Yeah, I think this is the sort of gets to the heart of this, that we really say we have a democracy, but how many of the choices that are big choices do we really get a voice in? I have greater and greater sympathy for those people who stormed the gates on January 6th as the people who felt we have no access to true democracy for us. You've stolen this from us. And this is our riotous reaction to that. One of the problems with our current situation is that we get caught in the labels somewhat, but we haven't developed a way of thinking, how is it that we can all get what we want in this system?
Yeah.
And go beyond the economic systems that have contained us, have restrained us in the past.
Yeah.
You know, as Kay said, you know, it was capitalism was an 18th century creation. Socialism, communism was the 19th century creation. We're in the 21st century, and we've got to put aside all the assumptions that some kind of cooperative action will lead to a dictatorship, and we will lose our freedom. Replace it by another system that gives us our freedom, gives us the right to decide. End of the sermon.
No, but
You don't want me to.
but you're exactly right,
Like,
Harvey.
mouth closed, but
Yeah, we have to
Okay.
figure out how to quit demonizing each other, because my rightist friends who will excuse January 6th will still vilify the Black Lives Matters of last summer, and vice versa. And how do we be in true conversation about that discontent that was driving both of those?
So the big element right now too is that the source of information is separate. That you know, like listening to Biden's town hall or whatever. You listen to this rational, or you read the rabbi's book and this whole grandiose vision that he has. I can't imagine that very many human beings would hear this and go, "Oh, no." You know, I think that it's that they're not hearing this. Nothing's being unpacked on the news sources now that conservatives are listening to. They're just being fed these labels
Yeah.
and inflammatory thoughts. And, you know, I just feel so sad because I feel like Biden is a great communicator for our time right now. But these people don't have access to what Biden is saying. They're hearing it all, you know, filtered through these conservative talking heads, you know, they don't hear.
Yeah. And that really is much of the problem right now, is how it is that we're getting information and how we're processing that information about each other.
I like how Rabbi Lerner talked about, you know, I think it's kind of true. I think that there's the power that be is trying to get people to turn against each other, because that way it keeps us from looking at who's really the problem. It's like if it keeps us fighting among each other, then we don't look at who's the real problem.
Yep. And I think that's what all of these things are trying to help us to look at differently. How do we see each other differently than what we are right now? Towards the end of the second section about the Global Generosity Plan, he said this: all humans have a deep need to care for each other as momentary embodiments of God. Because I talked to some of my deep rightist thinkers, and some of them I highly respect some of the things they're doing in their life, even though I detest their politics right now. But can I not let only the politics tell me the definition of that person? Because they're doing some really good and important things. And then they're doing this stuff which is evil, right? From my point of view. How do I sort through those two different sides of them? And I think they have the same problem with me. Go ahead, Leticia.
And Jim, you and I talked about subjective viewpoints this afternoon. And some of you don't know, 5 weeks ago, I ran across a young man, that 16-year-old that got displaced from his home. He'd been on the streets for a 3 days, and I took him in. And realized I was trying to save the world, and I could only do it with this one boy right now. And during the elections before last probably 12 years, I've been watching this divide grow. And we all talk to each other like we have this little box on each other's heads, and it's labeled left, right, and on communist. What was the word that they like to call, the right like to call the left? Snowflake. And when I started hearing snowflake being used by my leftist friends, and most of you know I consider myself a radical centrist, I realized we stopped seeing each other. All we're seeing is that label across the top of the box on our head. We need to start bringing it down a little bit and talking first about what's happening in our town, in our cities, in our neighborhoods, and then getting together as coalitions, as private coalitions, and start spreading out from there. I realized with this young man in front of me, I want to save the world too. We all do. I think the Beatles were talking about that in the 60s. But we can't. We have to look at what's in front of us. And if we're not talking to our neighbors, we're not going to save the country, let alone the world.
And I think that's why Rabbi Lerner is doing this the way he's doing it, is he's saying it can't be just a political movement. It has to be that all of us talk to all of us in some way or another. Because what he's proposing is radically changing of our society. Do we take the view, do we take the value of whoever has the most toys when he dies wins, which is what much of capitalism has come to? Or do we choose to see other values as more important? And how do we do that? That's not just a political thing. That's a spiritual movement.
Mhm.
Catherine, did I see your hand a little bit ago?
It was, and I'm thinking a couple of different things that, one of the things that I recall from, I guess, my being in the world is that the sandwich, if you have something that you want to get across, you might use the sandwich. And I always think of Oreo cookies when I say that, or think of that. And really what it means is that if I have something to say that's maybe not, I don't want to say a negative, but just like a thought about something, or maybe even a criticism, you might want to put that in the middle, but say something nice first, say something positive, say something that's joining and connecting. Yeah. And if you have to slip in that other piece, then follow it with something that's connecting and joining and validating. And it requires thinking and not just blurting out.
Well, I mean, it just goes down to the old adage, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And in our world right now, we're doing a whole lot of not caring about each other because we have the right answer already. And I believe that's where I sense my political opponents, if I can say it that way, is they have the right answer and I'm not listening to that right answer at all. And so all they hear from me is, you don't care about me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's easy to do that. It's reductionistic, but haven't we all gone there and succumb to that? And it's trying to get beyond it right now, but it's like, it feels like when I read things online and stuff, you know, some people are still, you know, carrying the Trump sign around, and, you know, they're still trying to, you know, just find some good in him. And then there's the other side that's still wanting to vilify. And I think we've got to get beyond it. And it seemed to me that with this book, you know, he's trying to get all of us to see that we don't have the answers, any of us actually in the moment, and we have to take it way beyond where we've been able to even be or think. I mean, this whole stuff is just amazing to me because I don't think I've ever thought through enough to get to some of these places, and I probably wouldn't have on my own. And there was something that I'm trying to get it up on my phone thing. This just came across in the last day or so, and I shared it. It wasn't from me, but it's worth thinking about. Renewable energy will replace fossil fuels, just like the light bulb replaced candles and the car replaced the horse. It's called progress.
Yeah.
And I think where we are is we're betwixt and between. It's kind of like being a teenager. We've got our feet in two different worlds. We're all supposed to be growing, and we struggle with that. We struggle with our adolescence.
Well,
no matter what our age.
and part of what you're talking about too, Catherine, is if I set things up as a dualistic this against this, one of these two things has to win, then we're in a different conversation than if we're trying to figure out what's a solution to what we can do for energy in America.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If it's only fossil fuels versus renewable, and I have to defeat the other side, Because I've seen people who, like about Texas, said, see, all the snow, that failed, but what saved Texas's grid? Well, nothing really saved Texas's grid. They just barely scraped by. It didn't quite get cold enough that it didn't completely trigger all the bad. That's it. Their whole system failed. And to say it was one or another, it was a systemic problem. And we have to go back to the system and say, how do we set up a better system? It wasn't one or the other that would have fixed it.
No.
So we have to have that a different conversation than what we do on too regular a basis.
I was thinking earlier in the conversation when we said people will defend military bases or military industrial production because it gives them employment. You know, one approach would be to find other sources of employment that are more I don't know how we do that, but maybe government creates a demand for that provides employment for less toxic output.
Yeah, and at least part of what I think he's trying to do with these things, and I think in my mind it needs to be developed much better than what he's done in these few pages. We've got to have better ways of being able to say this is how it's going to, because we can't just say let's move to a more environmentally sound practice if it means that in that other person's mind, well, that means that I'm going to lose this job and not be able to get any money in for my family. We've got to be able to figure out how to take those steps in ways that will continue the economic strength for the people that are involved.
It does seem like what Catherine was saying, we're in this betwixt kind of situation. I know Greg was telling me he read an article about GM is going to be, their vehicles will be 100% electric vehicles by what,
2030.
35.
That's what they've committed to.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's happening, you know, because the environment is telling us it has to happen.
Yeah, but I think one of the things why that was good, why this plan is good, is it's saying, yep, that's where we have to move, but we can't do that in a way that damages this community either. If I'm moving, I owe something to this community as a corporation. And so you can't just leave it high and dry, because that's what's happened in the Midwest, those old steel towns that are hurting so badly because of the loss of that production. It's that big steel moved out and didn't care for the community. And how do we as a nation care enough to help that not happen? So in the oil industries, one of my fellow classmates in Beeville, Texas, her name's Kelly Hughes. Hughes Oil is enormous in Texas, multi-billion company. What happens if we begin tapping that out? All the people that they're employing, something happens to them.
Mm-hmm.
Do we care enough, not about the oil industry, but the people in the oil industry?
I think there's one thing too, okay. There's two things that come to mind. One is we have huge infrastructure needs in this country.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our infrastructure is like, we have not put anything into our infrastructure in this country in a very long time. If we just put people to work fixing our infrastructure, that's huge. That right there would employ massive amounts of people. And
Be
the other
more
thing is,
specific. Be more specific.
well, improving highways, looking at how we get services, looking at how we do anything in just how our what do I mean by infrastructure? I mean, how our country's put together, our roads, our power grids, our education systems, our parks need huge amounts of work.
Sure.
Our utilities need huge amounts of work, you know, just the basic things of that our economy rests on, our very civilization rests on, have been ignored for so long that if we put people to work in doing other things that really need to be done. I mean, it's kind of like the New Deal thing where he did this whole thing where it's like, have people go out and build, I mean, a lot of our national parks and stuff, and a lot of things that happened them, we're building up our infrastructure. And the other thing I've read about recently is that, okay, we've had power barons in the past. We had the Rockefellers and all these people back then, but they gave huge amounts of money back to the country. They built museums. I'm not saying that these people are horrible. They did awful things, but they also gave huge amounts of things back to their communities. They built museums. They built all kinds of things, you know, just a whole bunch. They put a whole bunch of money back into the communities. You look at Amazon. What are they doing for us? They build warehouses and their trucks tear up the roads, and they don't. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's my thing.
Well, and I think that's part of the rabbi's point too, is he's trying to say, how do we help people see this not as a taxing effort, because that's what corporations have been doing way too much. I don't want to be taxed. I want to just make money, and that's how I'm giving back to my community. It's how do we put it into the realm of personal responsibility, corporate responsibility, that our job is not to make money for me, but to make a country that is great, and change the conversation that way. Leticia.
Jim and Harvey, and I'm sorry, Mr. Falk, I don't know your first name. You might be able to answer this. Are the highway systems in the United States still under the purview of the Defense Department?
No.
Not that I know of. I think it's
They
interior.
were originally, I don't know if the Department of Transportation was designed to pull that away, but it would be something for me of interest to know, because that answers the question of what we're going to do with military spending.
Yeah.
Right. And then the other, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. We also have to move forward cautiously on alternative energies like the battery powered cars, the windmill stuff. The windmills are done with composite materials now up in Idaho, where they were put up a lot during the Obama administration. They're falling apart, and there's no clean way to dispose of those composites. So we don't want to create a different kind of contamination of our system, of our ecosystem.
Yeah. But see,
just because the output's cleaner.
That's the being in conversation that needs to happen. And much of the answers about what we're talking about has to do with being in conversation. And it's really easy in our world right now to not be in conversation. We are in an argument often,
Yeah,
but very often not in conversation. And I
To
want
build
to,
on what Letitia just said too, it's like the batteries they're building need all kinds of these rare materials and stuff that are having to be mined, and it's like that's creating a whole nother.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we? But it's like, I look at, we are so dependent on our cars in this society. As someone who doesn't drive, this is like, try not driving in Tucson.
Yeah.
Especially if you live in the county and not in the city. There's no bus service up here. it's like now I've moved, so I'm living with someone who does drive. Man, I've been all over this city in the last week. I'm like, whoa, I haven't been to this intersection in like 3 years. I mean, up until 5 years ago, I drove everywhere. So it didn't, but by not driving, it's like, it really, I'm like, wow, if you don't drive a car in this country, that right there puts you on an ultimate fringe.
Right. And we have to ask a question, is that really needed? Or could we make different investments? There's no doubt that in much of the United States, we've decided that cars are the way to go. But in at least one of our major cities, New York City, a car is a secondary form of transportation to most of those inhabitants.
Well, hasn't there been a big push to build rapid transit between Tucson and Phoenix?
Why hasn't there?
Taken a lot of cars off the road, would get rid of a lot of emissions, but it's been obstructed and turned down repeatedly.
Yeah.
I can understand all that.
That's what Raytheon should be investing in.
Absolutely. That's exactly the type of thing that maybe we start saying, here's a different investment for you to make that contributes to our society in a different way, a constructive rather than destructive way. Now, the good news is name just slipped out of my head, sending ships into space.
Elon Musk.
He is also working on a high-speed rail system, already putting it in place between New York and Chicago. Right? What other places can we begin putting in different infrastructure that way?
Part of the problem is that assumes that people are going to want to go to that place.
It does.
And that's the problem we have. That, it's somebody looked at Los Angeles once and said, there's no there. There's no central place where people have to go.
Yeah.
Now, if you can build arteries out there, that might help. But the problem is, I want to have a car so that I can go to Swan and Broadway to the market or something, and it's just, I don't know.
6 stops along the way.
Yeah.
What was that?
And
Make
here's
6
my thing, I would, go ahead, Judy.
Well, I was just, I use the car much less than I used to, but I still try and do more than one stop when I'm out. I try and get more than one thing done, and so that puts it pretty far ranging. But what I've been hearing is that some cities are finding that they may be in trouble as the pandemic eases off, because so many people are working from home that mass transit in some of the big cities is not being used and may not be used again, because people may still work from home for a variety of reasons. And also some small businesses like cafes and things that are located downtown for people who work in offices are not going to be able to recover in the way that they have been before. So even if we don't want to face it, we're going to be forced to face some things simply by the circumstance that we're finding ourselves in.
And part of what you're saying, Judy, is, are we defending an anachronism? Even if it's still going to be around for 20 or 30 or 40 years, is it something that is on its way out? And how do we help that person move towards what is the future, not hold on to the past?
A little compact that we can all just float around with.
I wish, my dream is that we all drove Vespas or something. My dream is, what everybody has SUVs. I mean, it's like we drive around in these tanks now instead of, not even small cars or anything. It's like SUV. I don't know anybody that doesn't have an SUV. It's like you have to have a big car.
Yeah, but part of why why we like our cars, big, small, whatever. It has to do with something that's not about cars at all. It has to do with independence and freedom.
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying you don't need something huge to be mobile and independent.
I know,
You
but what
don't
I'm
need
saying
like
is we also have to figure out how to sell people on the fact that you don't need to have your own car to be independent and free.
Wish we had more young people in this group, because I do feel like young people think differently now than
Absolutely.
we just don't even have a sense of what they're about. And one of the things, I think the roads, Letitia, you were talking about, I think it is under the Department of Transportation, because Pete Buttigieg, took that position, and the people were like, why would he take that position? And it was because of Biden's plan to address infrastructure, that this really will be a big department, because it's going to deal with roads and transportation issues. And he's young, and I think, who knows what direction all of this stuff is going to go with these younger voices.
Yeah, and I do know on the right, they still think, and I've not investigated it, that highways are still under the auspices of the military. They were originally built to make sure that we could move for national security military forces across the country. I lived in Utah for a while, and the one thing I liked about Utah is, aside from Provo and Salt Lake proper and a couple others right around Salt Lake, those towns there are no more than 10 miles wide and 8 miles, or 10 miles long and 8 miles wide. And they didn't do this mass, like in Tucson, they started
Sprawl.
bringing out county property into the municipalities, and then Marana did the same thing. We've created inner cities that are too big for us to get around easily.
Yeah.
And what I saw in Utah is each of these little communities were pretty well self-contained.
Yeah. Well, here's the good news. You've pretty much solved this one. Now let's get to number 3, which is about the justice system. We have 1 minute.
Good luck.
These are huge issues. That's the bottom line with this. This is not going to be solved tomorrow.
Not even.
It's going to take a lot of work. It's about changing the conversations, and it'll take you talking to some of your friends who are of other minds, and me talking with some of my friends, and courage from across the political spectrums to start having different conversations than what we've had. Thus, why he's calling what we need is a love and justice party.
Mhm.
Not one that pushes this or pushes that, but that works on relationship. And so that's what we're going to talk about in our last thing, is about that love and justice, and how do we begin to have a different focus than what we've had before. And if you have thoughts about how to solve the justice system in America, the legal system, just send those in by text, and we'll read them and fix it. Thank you guys for your time today.
Yeah.
Constitutional change.
Goodbye, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Hey, Jim, are you
Yes.
still there?
I'm still here.
When does John Wilson's class on mysticism begin?
In about 2 weeks.
Will it
Not-
just follow up?
Yeah,
on
not this week coming up, but the week after, and it'll be at this hour. It'll
this? Very good. Okay.
I
okay,
was going to ask you that too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
and it'll be both at this hour and also at the 7 o'clock on Thursday hour.
I mean, will you knock it off?
So
I see dog. My granddaughter got home, and so now she's all excited. Okay.
good. All right, take care of you.